And you know what I'm going to say, right? Yeah. They vote and they're all real. Oh, my God. Yesterday, I was in a pretty damn dark mood when it came to the reality of what we're not doing to protect ourselves against Al-Qaeda, against ISIS, against anybody who would bring harm into this country. And it even appears clear to me that this one particular woman down in San Bernardino who was radicalized a couple of years ago, came here, married an American man, did what she did, indeed may be an operative as speculated, and one of many women already in the country doing the same thing. The term that I used was divided we fall. I took that from the name of a column it was really a good column. I did a little quoting from it yesterday. It was written by Cliff May, who is the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a columnist for the Washington Times. And with that mood in mind, divided we fall, Cliff May is joining us now on KMJ. And Mr. May, Cliff, I really appreciate you spending a little time with us today. Thank you much.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Glad you're reading my columns. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I got a kick out of this one because that's how I feel. Divided we fall. Let me pick your brain on that. Are you feeling that's where we're at now? Are we that divided that we could fall? And if so, why?
Yes, indeed. I think it is really astonishing and distressing that this many years after 9/11, and even more, something like 37 years after the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran, and these events, I would say, are connected. We can discuss that. Americans still are divided in terms of what the threat is that we face. And I would love to think, well, it's just President Obama who doesn't get it and he's being stubborn on this, but I don't think that's true. The New York Times, as you know, after the San Bernardino terrorist attack, had for the first time, I'm an alumnus of the New York Times. I used to be a editor, reporter, and foreign correspondent there. The New York Times ran a front-page editorial, first time they have done so since 1920. There was not a word in it about Islamism, about jihadism, about Islamic supremacy, nothing. It was all about gun control. It was about the guns are the problem, the NRA is the problem, gun manufacturers are the problem. It said the motives of those who committed the attacks in California really don't matter, and that there are politicians who are unfortunately distracting us with definitions of the word terrorism. They are entirely missing the point. Now, the New York Times has a specific audience, but it's the most prestigious paper in the country. President Obama has a following. The two Democratic candidates, who at this point in the polls would be certainly competitive, they agree much more with President Obama than me or I think you, with the basic premise that there is a war being waged against us, and it's being waged by people who subscribe to a specific ideology, and that ideology is one of supremacism, and it is one that seeks to defeat, dominate, and ultimately destroy us. The country can't even agree on this simple premise based on what our enemies have been telling us for more than 30 years.
Where do you think this head-in-the-sand attitude is coming from? Is it intentional? There are people out there that just don't want to know about the bad guys? Or are they of the most noble intent, that they've got other priorities, and that's really much more important to them?
You know, it's probably a mixture. There are a lot of people, and the Europeans are certainly among this, that just feel that there's no longer any good reason to have conflicts in the world, and because they think that, they sort of assume everybody else who matters must think that as well. So you have the Europeans who are, for the most part, no longer capable of projecting power. You have people, President Obama would be one, who think that the values he holds are universal values, therefore they must be held by others in the world if they'll just recognize that fact. There are others who think that that those fighting us have grievances, which we can address, and if we will, they'll put down their arms because their first choice is certainly not to kill us. There are those who think that it's mainly a matter of poverty. Actually, can I tell you one quick story that I think illustrates this? Is that okay? Just take maybe a second. I was at the home of the residence of an ambassador from a major European country. He had me and a couple other people from think tanks and somebody from the administration. And the subject was violent extremism. And the subject comes up, what causes violent extremism? So somebody says, well, if you're a young Egyptian male and you have no prospects for jobs and you probably are not going to find a wife, you get very frustrated. No wonder you go off and join the Islamic State. Oh, and somebody said, well, what about if you're a Saudi and you're rich? Well, you have a lot of money, but on the other hand, you're frustrated with the lack of freedom in Saudi Arabia. So despite you have a lot of the fact you have a lot of money, maybe you go off and join Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And then I said, and what about somebody who comes from, say, France or Britain? Oh, says one of the think tank people who have the same view. You know, if you're that person, despite the fact that you're probably living pretty well and you may have opportunities and jobs, you're going to school and you're learning about, English and Scottish kings rather than your own Islamic history, and that could make you very angry. I said, you're really going to tell me that someone goes off and joins the Islamic State because he's being forced to memorize Scottish kings in a British school? That makes sense to you, right? And, well, that's not quite the way I said it, Cliff. But it was. You see what I mean? It was. No matter what it is, there is some excuse, as opposed to the simple idea that there are people, and always have been since the time of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and Philip II of Macedonia, who wanted to conquer others. In fact, we are the strange ones that we don't want to conquer anybody else. They want to conquer us. They want to reestablish an empire, an Islamic empire. They want to reestablish a caliphate, which was wiped out in the early 1920s after World War I. And they believe in look, just like the communists believe that the proletarians must rule and the Nazis believe that the Aryans, the Germans must rule, these people believe it is only right that Muslims must rule. There must be a new empire, a new caliphate, and they're fighting for that. They're not fighting because they didn't get a good jobs program in Minneapolis last year.
Do you think they feel this way in part because we let them? And by that I mean our reactions to what they do in terms of a military confrontation and or whatever, been very weak, very measured, very restrained. Therefore, Allah has got to be on their side because look at these Westerners. They're not doing anything to try to stave us back.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's one additional point to it. They look at the West and they see the West as decadent. And by decadent, I mean in the sense that it is falling apart, that people don't really believe in anything here, that this is a society that Europe is certainly post-Christian. And what do they believe in after that? Well, I don't know, multiculturalism. Multiculturalism seems like it's sort of a sweet thing that's meaningless, but it's actually not. Because if you say that all cultures are the same and all cultures are equal and one culture can't be seen as better than another, then how do you say that the culture of the Islamic State is worse than the culture of, say, France or Germany or England? And they also, a lot of our people have this tremendous guilt about imperialism and colonialism and are too ignorant to understand that Islamic imperialism and colonialism has a long history, even if it was defeated for a while. And so there seem to be, particularly in Europe, a lot of people who kind of just want to give up, kind of want to surrender, kind of want to submit. But our enemies do think, yes, we are weak, we are ready to fall, it is their turn to rise, and that if they push us, we will crumble, that we are like the World Trade Towers, look strong, look sturdy, but hit them a couple of times, they will crumble. That's what they believe, and I think we give them a lot of reason to believe that when we don't stand up on our hind legs and fight to defend our lives and our society. And by the way, at a time when we've got our soldiers going out to defend freedom, on how many campuses are the college administrators and professors fighting not with their lives but just with their reputations to defend freedom, to say, when people get up to speak, we do not shout them down on this campus because that is antithetical to our notion of liberty. How many campuses is that happening? Not nearly enough, in my view.
Amen to that. If you just joined us, Clifford May is the president of the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, also a columnist for the Washington Times. Let me get your opinion, if I could, Cliff. You know, for long we have been preoccupied at the enemy outside of the borders, the enemy on the other side of the ocean, the enemy out there in the desert, the enemy out there somewhere. But now the enemy really appears to have manifested itself here in domestic terra firma. To your way of thinking, the San Bernardino thing with this particular woman, isolated, or could there be a whole network of these operatives already in the USA and ready to strike?
Well, I think there are clearly cells, and there probably is something of a network, and the question is how large and how pervasive. It's probably larger in Europe than it is here. On the other hand, I do not believe that we have the proper vetting procedures in place that we need to keep out those who would be of this persuasion, or to necessarily know when people are becoming radicalized. I mean, and to say becoming radicalized, I hate to use that phrase. It's kind of meaningless. What we really mean is people who are embracing an ideology that seeks to destroy the American system of government and the American way of life, as well as what's left of it in Europe. So we do have a problem with that, and it is a problem that we have to, in terms of who comes here temporarily and who comes here to immigrate and live permanently. And it's much worse, of course, in Europe. I was with a friend of mine from Spain the other day, and he said what people in Europe don't seem to understand is if we take this wave of immigrants in and we give them housing and health care, language training and job training, you think there won't be another wave behind that, and another wave behind that, and another wave behind that, and eventually doesn't the welfare system collapse? And among these people, most will not pick up weapons and use them against us. But a minority are coming in with that intent, and there are others who will be ripe for radicalization, ripe for recruitment later, especially if they don't succeed. If the blacksmith doesn't learn good German and get a new profession and can't make a living and gets frustrated, will he blame himself, or will he blame infidel society and decide that the caliphate has a right to do what caliphates do, which is to strip infidels of their wealth and their women and take slaves and dominate them and make them submit? Which is more likely to happen? Again, in most cases, not the terrible thing. But it doesn't take many. 19 to bring down the World Trade Center, 8 to do what they did in Paris the other day, 2 to do what they did in San Bernardino.
Cliff, I realize we don't have a lot of time, but one name that I have to drop on you is the obvious name. You've talked about the reasons why we are divided, and out of these divisions, this has given birth. It's sort of the genesis of the development of a Donald Trump. Yet, rather than him being the panacea to the divisions, you look at him as being one of the most divisive characters ever to run for the presidency. Talk to me about Trump.
Well, I do. I mean, I kind of think he is. I kind of think Obama, in some ways, President Obama created him. I mean, you have President Obama saying for 7 years
Agreed.
that the Islamic State is neither a state nor Islamic, despite the fact that it proclaims itself Islamic, and probably Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-declared caliph of the Islamic State, who has a doctorate in Islamic theology, probably knows more than he does. Al-Azhar University, which is the biggest center of Sunni Islamic learning in Egypt, in Cairo, they don't support Baghdadi, but they also will not call him a heretic, just as many imams I met a few years ago in Pakistan wouldn't call Osama bin Laden a heretic. Why? Because if you're a fundamentalist, by definition, you're not a heretic, right? You have a medieval reading of the religion. It hasn't varied, but it's not heretical because you haven't varied from it. By definition, it's not. Now, you have Obama saying for 7 years, just denying the truth for 7 years, and then you have somebody like Trump say, I know what we got to do. We just got to keep all the Muslims out of the country, at least for a while, until we figure out what's going on here. And that sounds, to a lot of ears, kind of refreshing. He's not worrying about political correctness, and he's the opposite of President Obama. The truth is not that all Muslims – look, I think this is a hard concept for some, but I don't know why. All Muslims are not terrorists, but most of the terrorists we have in the world today are Muslims. That means that within the Islamic world, the Ummah as they call it, there are these medieval interpretations of Islam that have become resonant, that people are embracing, and that are leading to what I call jihadism, the decision that the most important thing you can do is pick up a weapon and fight the infidels. I have to say, in my view, I don't see. And listen, a lot of political rules have been broken. If I fear that to support Trump means you're supporting Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or whoever becomes the next Democratic nomination, which means you're supporting another 4 years of essentially President Obama's policies. I don't think I understand I understand what Trump is trying to say. I understand why people find it somewhat refreshing. I do not believe that he is capable of being the president of the United States and coming together with us on a strategy. I don't think he knows the difference between a Salafi jihadist and a Sufi or a Sikh. And I think you have to know some of that stuff if you're going to not turn the wheel of the car so far you go off the road on the other side.
In the seconds remaining here, tell us about your organization, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
So it is a think tank, a policy institute. It is focusing on national security, and particularly the national security threat, the most important one we face, which comes from Islamism, from jihadism. It was formed in just after the 9/11 attacks. But my first conversations about it occurred about a week before the 9/11 attacks, and those were with Jack Kemp and Gene Patrick. Some of your listeners who are older remember who those people are, but they saw America taking a holiday from history. Love them, exactly. And they saw us taking a peace dividend, and they said, you know what? I think we still have enemies in the world that are not being focused on, and they pointed to the terrorist attacks of 1983 in Beirut and 1993 at the World Trade Center for the first time. They didn't know it was the first time. 1996, Khobar Towers. That was probably Iran and al-Qaeda working together. 1998, two of our embassies got blown up in Africa. The U.S.'s coal in 2000. Why, they said, is nobody connecting the dots and trying to see what kind of enemy we have, what we should call them, what they want, and how we defeat them. And I tell you, I'm a little frustrated that these years later, I think, and this goes back to the column, half the country still doesn't get it, doesn't understand the threat we face and how we have to deal with it. It has to be our main priority for a while, much more so, I'm afraid, than such things as global warming.
Clifford May from the Washington Times and the Foundation of Defense for Democracy. Thank you, sir, for the times and your words this afternoon. And we'll maybe talk to you again down the road. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.